good morning or afternoon. Let's wait one more minute until most attendees are there. All right, it's 1:11 my time, at least, Central European time. Welcome to this Veeam Backup for Azure webinar specifically for service providers. If you are attending and you're not a service provider, that's fine as well. You can learn about what our service providers can actually do for you if you're an end customer, an end user, and you're looking into outsourcing some of these Veeam related services. My name is Michael Joff. I'm a system engineer for service providers in the Benelux region. Let's move on to the agenda for today. I'm starting with a quick overview of modern data protection, as in data protection for the public cloud. From a Veeam perspective, of course, an architecture overview for service providers, how Veeam Backup for Azure actually works, with plenty of high-level and detailed designs, and some sizing to allow you to get the right virtual machines, etc., the right specs for your deployments in the public cloud. So this is part of a series of webinars for Veeam Backup for public cloud. The AWS one was a couple of weeks ago, and there's another one for Google Cloud coming up in about 2 weeks. I'll focus on Azure and only sporadically mention AWS and Google Cloud, since we're living in a hybrid cloud world. Onto the introduction of modern data protection. I just mentioned hybrid cloud, hybrid infrastructure. That's the new normal, of course. Basically, this slide is to inform you, based on a trends report, that the hybrid infrastructure is the new norm, with a separation or expansion of the network to the public cloud, to other managed clouds, virtual machines in your own data centers for end customers, at least, and physical servers. It's a hybrid setup, and for a hybrid setup, of course, you need to have a backup and replication setup that is able to comply with all this, that is able to back up all these different workloads, and preferably, from as few panes of glass as possible, and of course, this becomes more complex. So it's nice to have a managed service provider do this for these enterprises to make things easier on them. Of course, 61% of organizations still rely on built-in snapshots of cloud storage in the public cloud, which is good for low RPOs and low RTOs, but it's not independent. It's expensive to retain. There's a cumbersome, the file level restores are problematic, and it's a point solution. So it's not very scalable. It could be good for certain use cases, but in the long run, it's not always practical. So for the public cloud data protection portfolio, from a Veeam perspective, as mentioned before, we have Veeam Backup for AWS, for Azure, and for Google Cloud. And well, the main focus for these products is, of course, to be able to seamlessly move apps and data across private and public cloud or to on-premises, so to fully embrace that hybrid cloud approach. The fast, flexible recovery for entire VMs, volumes, files, and folders, of course, and to be able to use cost-effective storage archives, reuse really the native tooling as much as possible. And an important thing to mention, of course, with these three cloud providers is that we're looking to avoid having cloud platform lock-in. So to have that portability of data is also essential in our current state of infrastructure development. I mentioned it just now. It's important to be able to do backup and recovery too from within and across the cloud among all these public clouds. And especially with the upcoming NIS2 directives in Europe, which all organizations need to comply to, we need to be able to fully be in control of our data or have a managed service provider be in control of that data for an enterprise that is not specialized in IT, so to speak. So recover anywhere, cross-subscription, cross-region, cross-platform, of course, restores. It's not just about restoring full instances, but also to have that granularity of restoring specific files, very important. Also with costs involved, you don't want to necessarily restore a full image, but just a specific file. So there's no unnecessary egress costs involved. Well, the costs involved for that one specific file. And it needs to be simplified. So as all Veeam products, it's all wizard driven, it's automated, and there are a lot of self-service workflows available as well. Especially nice for managed service providers, because if a customer is able to self-service their restores, then there's a lot of tasks that are taken out of hand, where a end customer can really find that specific file they want to restore and not bother an IT desk or a partner to raise a ticket, etc., and do that for him. So it's a lot. It's really well, not as time-consuming and saving resources. Onto the supported services. From an IaaS point of view, we support Azure VMs, of course, Azure SQL database, Azure Files, and also storage-wise, Azure Blob, hot and cold storage, and Azure Archive. And one more thing before I move to the high-level designs is the Azure native backup and recovery. There are actually two flavors, two available options, basically. You have Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure, which is a standalone solution to back up Azure workloads within Azure only, or you can use Veeam Backup and Replication, which is the #1 backup and recovery for unified, hybrid, and multi-cloud data protection and mobility. So it gives more options. But I'll dive into that with the help of the various high-level designs. It's easier to explain. Onto the next chapter, the architecture overview for service providers. So first of all, what do we want to achieve as a managed service provider? Specifically focusing on Azure, of course. I'll omit most other use cases. There's a best practices website that you're probably familiar with, bp.veeam.com/sp for service providers. It includes our core use cases. One of the use cases being public cloud, and that's what I'm focusing on today. So I'll omit all the backup as a service and disaster recovery as a service, etc. Onto the high-level diagram. So say your customer has resources or workloads in Azure. I should stick to one pronunciation. So first of all, you want to back up cloud native Azure object storage. That's the first item there, to Azure Blob or different S3 compatible storages. And then back up these copies. So awkwardly said. So you can back up, make a copy of these storages to your own MSP cloud, or number 3 right there, it could be copied to an offsite backup location on the customer site. That's all something you can decide on. You can also do both. It's all about having multiple copies, multiple versions of each workload. So the service provider's main benefit here is that there are no upfront costs. You only pay for the licenses consumed by the customer. That's opening a whole can of worms, actually. But I'm not going to go too much into licensing in this webinar. That's something that you will need to pick up with one of our account managers or sales reps. But there's a whole model of rental licenses and consumption-based licensing. Then another benefit is the cloud native part. So you can do agentless backup and recovery built for the public cloud. The cost calculation, there's a forecast in spending, and you can avoid unexpected expenses. You can also expand services. So you can start with offering only local backups, for example, and expand into offsite backup and fully managed services and other services. So all the designs I'm showing, it's not necessarily a choice, but you can kind of build up this whole infrastructure. And of course, automation is also a plus for managed service providers. You can fully manage and automate the solution via RESTful API. So integrate that with your own managed service provider tools, portals, or monitoring systems. And for the customer, there are many benefits as well. They can focus on their own business, 100% on their own needs, and let the service provider take care of the rest. The data portability, it's easy to move data across any supported environment for migration, disaster recovery, or compliance purposes. And in the end, of course, ransomware protection, that's a hot item. You can isolate backups from production to secure against ransomware and cyber threats by leveraging cross account or region backups. Sorry. So first of all, there are two main designs. There's the pod architecture and the multi-tier architecture. First of all, the pod architecture. So the idea of this is to create a dedicated management infrastructure per customer. So it's a set of Veeam backup for public cloud components deployed in a specific account to protect only the data of this account. The main components are Veeam backup for public cloud, the set of workers, and cloud storage, of course. So while service providers distribute the pods, all the protected data is manageable through the Veeam backup and replication, which you also see there. And all pods are protected data from public cloud are visible within VBR, so the Veeam backup and replication server. So there's no real limitation on the number of pods you can manage by Veeam backup and replication, by the Veeam backup and replication server. And the amount won't affect the actual license consumption. So it's just protected workloads that are counting to the license consumption. What I'm showing here also is just the management side of things. You don't see, well, there's Azure Blob, but we're not going into detail about what's happening with the storage and how to replicate or restore anything. It's just a matter of how to manage this environment. And you see, of course, the Veeam Service Provider console, which allows you to manage not only on-premises workloads, but also public cloud, Microsoft 365. Yeah, you can really manage the entire Veeam portfolio, so to speak, with Veeam Cloud Connect, which is pretty much a Veeam backup and replication server with additional features that allow for a secure TLS connection with the, in this case, Microsoft Azure tenant of the, well, in this case, the provider account. On port 443, and there's a whole list of ports that are needed for communication within the tenant and within the service provider environment. All this can be found, of course, on the best practices website or in Help Center. Don't think it's necessary to really go into the details there. So the pros and cons of the pod setup. It's a good choice when the requirement is to share full access to the appliance, of course, and you need to make sure to separate the production, subscription, and backup account. So if one account is compromised, another will be safe. Before I move on, I forgot to mention that at the beginning. My apologies. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. I have a colleague, Alexander, in the chat who is available to answer all your questions, as this webinar format doesn't allow you to raise hands or ask questions directly to me. So we're keeping the flow into this webinar, and in the meantime, my colleague is well experienced and can answer all questions you may have. So my apologies for not mentioning this at the beginning. Yes, back to the presentation, pros and cons. So you can run everything under a single subscription, both tenants and service providers. It's self-service capabilities. You have that. The storage containers may be deployed in any region, anytime. RBAC can be utilized, and the con, of course, it's all in one subscription, one appliance. So you have to deploy that per customer, a subscription appliance per customer. Whereas the shared access architecture is the following one. The core idea of this is to provide fully managed backup services for customers, multiple customers, and a service provider to host and manage the Veeam backup infrastructure for all the cloud workloads. In this case, the backup and recovery operations will run in the service provider's subscription. So let's see. The source of the data is the production data located in the public cloud account of the tenant. So you see a specific tenant account 1, tenant account 2 at the left side of the screen. Then you have the service provider account, which has the worker instances, the Azure Blob container, and onto the, once more, mainly focus on connectivity, the service provider environment, which contains the Veeam Service Provider console. And if you're not familiar with the Veeam Service Provider console, this is something that a service provider can use in order to manage customer backup jobs and whatnot. It's fully API driven, so everything you see in that console can be also steered via REST API. And the console is also available to customers if the customer requires that or the service provider wants that. So the customer would see like a light version of the service provider console, focusing, of course, only on their own workloads and allowing them to see the different backup jobs and the status, if they're successful or not, etc., from one central pane of glass. So it could be nice if it's especially for customers that have various regions, multi-cloud, or just various environments, various subscriptions. Yeah, that's one central point that is also practical for customers to to look into. Sorry. So in this case, the service provider will host the Veeam Backup for Public Cloud appliance. Also, the worker instances per tenant. They should be placed as close as possible to the production infrastructure, and at least in the same region to reduce costs and costs of backup and restore processing. The storage accounts per tenant, you could also attach storage from the cloud to Veeam Backup and Replication and make recoveries there without exposing the third-party data. Mentioned the service provider console already. Let's see, yeah, and of course the self-service capabilities are interesting, not only by through the service provider console, but also for file restores and others. I've mentioned that already. Onto the pros and cons. Of course, the pros is that the backup and restores are managed by the service providers. The billing for backup and recovery are also covered by the service provider subscription. Very interesting as well. Within the service provider console, there's a whole section about billing where the billing invoicing per customer can be set up. So we've put a lot of effort in that in order to help our managed service providers with a more solid invoicing tool. For those that have already built that themselves, that's fine. But yeah, some of them don't have that, so that offers an additional automation, so to speak, to have that tool already in place. Managed service provider doesn't have to build it from scratch or specifically for Veeam. We have that already within the service provider console. And everything is under control in the service provider from a service provider perspective. And now the negative points or cons, I should say, is that the self-service operations are available if the appliance is used on a per tenant basis. So RBAC won't split scopes of protected data. And there's a share access between accounts that is possible. Now, how does Veeam Backup for Azure actually work? Now I'm stepping away a little bit from the managed service provider aspect and just focusing on the actual Veeam Backup for Azure tool. Of course, all this is also available in AWS and GCP. So once more, it's a native, cost-effective, and secure backup and recovery solution. There's a direct restore capability. So in 2 steps, you can recover any workload in AWS or Azure. And there are some examples, of course, of intercloud backups and replication. So that's why I'm mentioning another cloud provider. A backup copy or migrating workloads to on-premises is also a possibility via an external repository. And unlimited long-term retention is available via the native Amazon S3 or Azure Blob solutions. So let's hang in here for a while. Let's see. Let's make this really simple. On the left, you see the production subscription. So now, yeah, like I said, this is not in a managed service provider approach. This is just focusing on the Azure tooling, or I should say, Veeam Backup for Azure tooling, how an end customer would use this on their own, just to explain how it interacts with different elements of Azure, what is possible actually in backing up various Azure workloads. So you have the appliance subscription. That's where all the Veeam, let's say Veeam stuff is living. And you have the storage subscription where you have the actual storage stored. Not to paraphrase myself too much. So in the Veeam Backup for Azure uses the following components for the backup process: a backup appliance, hosted on a VM, of course, to control backup operations via a service bus in the middle of the screen. Not sure if you can see my mouse. To communicate with the workers. It's actually a worker pool. It's used to run the backup operations that send data to repositories. So you're sending that data towards the repositories in the storage subscription. You need a storage account, of course, for the worker provisioning, and a storage account is used as the backup repository. So first of all, the workers are created to form a worker pool with the correct networking in place. It's essential. The existing workers are reused, but maybe shut down when not active. And once workers are deployed, binaries are installed using the packages stored on the dedicated storage account used for provisioning. This dedicated storage account is provisioned automatically when you're installing, when doing the initial install. So once the deployed workers are communicating via the service bus, there's an ongoing, well, an ingoing and outgoing queue per worker created. So this service bus is provisioned automatically when doing the initial install, as mentioned. Then the worker service starts processing the backup at the source. So the workers can also be used to manage repository operations and data tiering. Let's see. So now we can zoom into the different workloads, Azure VMs or Azure SQL, Azure Files. It's a slight different approach, but they're all handled by the workers. That's what it comes down to. Sorry. Based on the worker pool settings, the workers can be stopped and removed if over the minimum worker count is configured. They can be reused as part of the same job policy run as well, or the next time a job runs, so they can really, they're reusable. That's what it comes down to. And finally, VMs, files, and exports can be restored by using the source snapshots, if applicable, or Azure Blob repository data on the right. For full level, file level, recovery, a helper is used as well. It's not mentioned here, but I don't want to go too much into detail. Yeah, on to the next slide, which shows the hybrid multi-cloud support. So very quickly, it's the same story. I've added centralized management at the bottom. And you have on the right an on-premises environment or an other cloud at the top right, Amazon EC2 or Compute Engine, where you want to you may want to restore some workloads. The options or possibilities are there. This is how ideally a customer would set up Azure backup for Microsoft Azure if they have to handle it themselves. Yeah, it's not too complex. It's just that well, the expertise is not always there on customers' end, and when the environment is growing and becoming multi-cloud, multi-region, multi-subscription, of course, yeah, it's becoming more complex, and it's good to have that outsourced by managed service providers. I've mentioned Azure, Google Cloud, and AWS, but how about other public clouds? So we would service them in a good old-fashioned way, so to speak, in a similar way as how we're handling hardware servers. So we're installing Veeam agents, and they're VBR managed or managed by the service provider console. We have a similar approach to what we do in the physical world, so to speak. So it's possible, and we can include that in the multi-cloud strategy. So next up, I am just going to zoom into some capabilities of Veeam Backup for Azure via some high-level designs. And once more, I don't want to confuse you with the managed service provider model. Although you can manage a customer's on-premises VBR server by logging in remotely. Sorry, onto the next one like this. This could also be used in a managed service provider setup, as in this is fully customers on-premises location and a Azure subscription of the same customer. And as a managed service provider, well, you would be logging into the customer's VBR server and managing their backups and restores in such a way. It's not scalable. It's possible if you manage a few customers like this, but it's also good to start in such a way. And then while developing the service, you can morph to the MSP architecture. So sorry, this is for backups in the Azure cloud. And you can also do an instant VM recovery from the Azure cloud. Of course, there are a lot of slides coming up now with these type of designs. I just wanted to assure you that these slides will be available for you after the call, after the webinar. So no worries if it's going a bit too fast. You will have all the time in the world to study them. And they're available, of course, on the best practices site and on Help Center, probably on Pro Partner Portal as well. So instant VM recovery from the Azure cloud. You would have a VBR external repository as well on premises, and you can do instant VM recovery initiated from VBR, from the Veeam Backup and Replication server. Let's see what else. Backup copy from the Azure cloud, of course, is an option. This is mainly just to stir up use cases and possibilities, things you can make your customers aware of what is possible when they're using the public cloud and how to back up, what kind of backups they can do from on-prem to Azure, the other way around, and also to other public clouds. There's the backup copy, of course, initiated from the VBR as well. A full recovery on premises from a backup copy is also possible. Yeah, you have the full VM restore on-prem from from various workloads, from an Azure workload or from an on-prem workload, if it's a VM at least. We can't do that with a physical machine, of course. We don't have that portability. Direct restore to the Azure cloud is also interesting. That's approaching a disaster recovery setup. Not really, but like a miniature version of that. Well, to have that ability of restoring a workload from on-prem to the Azure cloud, or an Azure workload to another region or subscription. It's all about also the high availability and redundancy. It's essential to business continuity, to keep the business running. That's our main focus, pretty much. I mentioned this before, the restore from AWS to Azure, or a reverse, the other way around. So we have the ability to do that with Veeam tooling. Sorry. So there's a direct restore to Microsoft Azure from Amazon in this case, with the EC2 instances, for example. And yeah, you can also migrate back to on-premises. And as mentioned before, we have the upcoming NIS2 directives. It's important not to have that public cloud platform lock-in, and being in full control of your assets, of your workloads, compliance-wise and also security-wise. I haven't mentioned ransomware yet, but that's also a classic use case for having all these different locations Yes. So onto the sizing. I'm just going to mention the core components actually to size. So we're looking at the Veeam Backup for Azure appliance or the virtual appliance, the data movers or the so to speak, the workers, object storage, so Azure Blob repository in this case, and the DBR server. For optional, well, there are optional items as well, which I'm not mentioning here, but you can look them up on the best practices website. So once more, that's bp.veeam.com/sp. I hope my colleague Alexander could paste the URL in the chat. He'd be kind enough to do so. So first of all, the appliance in Azure, we have different sizes. We have a default, we have a medium and a large. Of course, different machines, different specs, different memory sizes, all for a certain number of advised maximum number of workloads. So all these values are based on Q&A testing and recommending the recommended maximums. Yeah. So it's not a limit. You can go above this, but it's not advisable if you want the optimal performance. And performance is something we touch upon on a daily basis, not just from a Veeam sizing point of view, but also from a connectivity point of view. So it's important to really look into your infrastructure when you're delivering backup managed services, to not just look at the sizing for the Veeam tooling, but also the connectivity, the storage, what type of storage it is. A lot of the performance actually depends on the storage device at the end of the chain. Yeah, these once more can be found online, and you will see them in the shared documents at the end of the webinar. Then onto the Azure Blob repository. So in general, the required space in object storage will be with less than 50% of the source data. So there's some compression going on, and we store some metadata. Of course, we don't do synthetic fulls all the time. We do incremental backups as well to be more efficient. Yeah, these are the numbers for both hot and cold tiers and archive tiers. Onto the workers in Azure. So these workers are demanding a different instance types, different VMs, also divided into small, medium, large, and archiving with some backup speeds, some indications of speeds, also very good to have. And by the way, on that same best practices site, there is also we have calculators to be able to really size all the elements in detail, so you can enter different variables and get results based on that. And of course, the pre-sales engineer is always there to assist you in helping you size your managed services platform. So all this to say that there are many tools to get to a managed service platform that is well sized and well architected. Now, for the actual worker placement, so first of all, the worker leverages an Ubuntu image and also Veeam Backup for Azure binaries downloaded from the dedicated storage account. And it's deployed in the same resource group and subscription as the Veeam Backup for Azure solution. So here's a table with some items summarized, but it comes down to having the workers in the same region as the Veeam Backup for Azure solution. So whether it's for creating backups of Azure VMs or file level restores from snapshots, yeah, that's an essential element or element of the design. Some recommended maximums, also important to mention for the workers. So the recommended workers for default appliance size is 50. And there are also some limitations, I have to say, from an Azure Management API point of view. There are some limited throttling. You need to be aware of that as well. So there's a link at the bottom where you can read more about that. Yeah, it's also good to know with the performance topic in mind. And last but not least, there's a backup cost calculation tooling in the Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure solution. So obviously this is based on what is commonly known, commonly shared online, and it's updated, of course. But what I'm trying to say is that if you have a specific kind of, how do you call that? A discount from Azure or a specific partnership pricing from Microsoft, then these do not entirely apply. Then this would just be an indication of what you could expect. And you probably have a better deal if you have a specific partner agreement with Microsoft. Yeah, but it's giving you at least a very good indication and a quite accurate figure if you don't have the aforementioned partnership levels or partner discounts with Microsoft. So you can proactively avoid unexpected expenses and cloud overspend, since as a managed service provider, you'll be getting well, these costs. And also if you set up the solution in such a way that you're only managing a customer's environment, then at least you can give the customer some additional insight on what the cost estimation is for the backups and the Veeam elements, which they can also get from a central Microsoft overview, billing and invoicing overview, but yeah, maybe this offers more granularity from that point of view. And hereby, we have reached the end of the webinar. I'd like to thank you for attending, and yeah, please be patient for this to be published, and also the PDF of this presentation will be shared with you with all the necessary links that are mentioned there and the various designs. So I'd like to thank you for attending. Thank you, Alexander, for answering to the questions in the chat. And I'd like to wish you a very nice day.